All right, so the next section we're going to be talking about is forgetting. And so, Jill Price, this lady here, it was one of those endless memory people. Remember, they were the ones we watched in the beginning of class that never forget anything. Well, she was one of the few that actually describes it as horrible, and she says that it's a terrible thing. And instead of kind of being fun and free loving like some of the people that we saw, where she's kind of insisted that this is a horrible thing. So what we call what she has is hyperthamnesia. She not only recalls everything, but she's also unable to forget anything. She talks about, both the important and mundane, a kind of this running movie that's going on. And she talks about it as being intrusive and kind of overwhelming. Now, one of the problems, obviously another problem is that we might not be able to focus on the current stimuli because of the intrusive memories. And so if you're always remembering things from your past, how well are you forming new memories? And at what point does it start to tip to be kind of where you're too distracted almost? So, this idea of forgetting is something that, we've been really trying to understand because, research tells us that our long-term memory is unlimited. So how then and what then is forgetting? Well, we've talked about some of these people kind of throughout this section. HM was one of the first people to have his hippocampus removed. And what we found is he was unable to form new explicit memories, but he could still do his procedural memories. Okay, and that again, that has to do, remember, with the different places in our mind that our memories are stored. So what we've found is that there's different types of amnesia. There's different types of forgetting. Okay, so two of the major types of amnesia, okay, is retrograde amnesia and anterograde amnesia. Retrograde amnesia refers to the inability to retrieve memory of the past. Okay, so those of you that are the Vow fans, this is like what happened in The Vow. Anterograde amnesia refers to the inability to form new memories, or new, I should specify, new long-term declarative or explicit memories. People with anterograde amnesia still tend to be able to do the procedural or implicit memories. Okay, so anterograde amnesia is like Dory in Finding Nemo. Okay, so retrograde amnesia typically can be caused by a head injury or emotional trauma and is typically temporary. It could also be caused by more severe brain damage, and in that case, it may include anterograde amnesia as well, so you might have both. HM and Jimmy both lived with no memories after the surgery. The movie Memento, okay, is a movie based off of this idea of anterograde amnesia. Okay, but for the most part, most movie amnesia is retrograde amnesia. So again, in terms of trauma and injuries and surgeries, in your lifespan, there's different, forms of amnesia that we see, and depends on kind of what happened in the different cases. Now, in class we did the Penny memory test, and this is a retrieval test. Remember, we looked at, can you recall the memory? And what we found is that most of you could not do this. It was difficult. And again, why? Well, because of encoding failure. That's what we talked about. The fact that, you got the image wrong. Did you fail to retrieve the information, or did you never know in the first place? And for most of you, it was probably because you didn't know in the first place, because that's not the details of a penny that you tried to encode. So one of the things that we talk about in terms of forgetting, it's not that we actually forgot it, it's that we never had it in the first place. Because if we never encoded it from our working short-term memory into our long-term memory, then technically we did forget it. But more specifically, we never encoded it. So encoding failure is actually one of the leading causes of forgetting. Storage decay also plays a role. So material encoded into long-term memory will decay if the memory is never used, recalled, or restored. Okay, so decay is LTP in reverse, kind of like pruning. So remember, long-term potentiation is the strengthening and the building of all those neural networks and putting all those retrieval cues, and you having lots and lots and lots of retrieval cues that allow you to easily access information. Well, what happens with storage decay is if that you never use those, you start to drop off all those retrieval cues, and those nets start to disintegrate, so you have fewer and fewer retrieval cues, which make it much more difficult for you to recall the memory. So, encoding failure is one major reason, and then storage decay is another reason. Now, in research, what we did find, and Ebbinghaus did this again. So he did both the learning curve, which we talked about before, and then this is what we refer to as the forgetting curve. He found that memory decay tends to have a rapid drop, and then it kind of levels off. Okay, so for instance, they studied Spanish class, and what they found is that immediately after ending a Spanish class, people lost just about 40–50% of what they had, but then they kept the majority of that, and they lost very few of that remaining percentage. So tip of the tongue, again, another, we talked about this again in class as well, this retrieval failure of tip of the tongue. It's not necessarily the memory doesn't decay instead of the associations and the links. So it's kind of this we know it's there, our brain is trying to spit it out, our long term is trying to give it to our short term, but for whatever reason we just can't make that circle, this cycle of long term, short term complete. Now, we also talk about interference, okay? So we talk about two different types of ways that old and new memories interfere with each other, making it difficult to store new memories and to retrieve old ones. So occasionally the opposite happens. In positive transfer, old information makes it easier to learn, related new information, and this is in kind of like math class, right? The more old math stuff, algebra, geometry, trigonometry that the easier it is to learn new stuff, kind of like calculus. So we refer to this as positive transfer. But when it gets in the way, when it's called interference, is we have two different types. Proactive interference, which occurs when past information interferes, okay, with learning new information. So you have many strong memories of a previous principle, and this memory makes it difficult to learn the new principle's name. Okay, so proactive interference is when old information gets in the way of learning new information. Okay, now retroactive interference occurs when new stimuli, learning new stuff, interferes with the storage and retrieval of previously formed memories. Okay, so retroactive interference is when new gets in the way of old. Proactive interference is when old gets in the way of new, we're calling new, and retroactive interference is when new gets in the way of old. All right, so and sleep plays a role in this, because what we have found is that after sleep, okay, we actually, when you sleep after you were trying to learn something, you recall it better, okay, than when you try to learn something and then you stay awake, because again, you have all of that interference that occurs. All right, and then the last thing, is kind of a controversial aspect of forgetting, but it's motivated forgetting. Is it possible for us to choose to forget or change our memories? Sigmund Freud was very into this. He did believe that sometimes our unconscious buried our memories and prevented us from recalling them, and he called this repression. However, what we do know now is that, we believe that this is very difficult. Okay, because of the fact, that highly emotionally impactful things, aren't easy for us to forget. Okay, motivated to forget is not common. More often, recall is full of errors. People try not to think about painful memories, and if they fail to rehearse those memories, the memories can fade over time. So, repression is definitely a very controversial subject, but more often than not, what we think is that, it's very difficult for us to actually forget something